Hello, so this is part 2 of my journeys through therapy, and I'm actually in a place that's outdoors at the moment. It's part of the RPA, actually, and University of Sydney. It's a campus of its own, and it's got this great little garden, and I can pick up Wi-Fi because I'm a professor. Just a big note, not a real professor. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney. So I get access privileges. Yes, very good. I think they're actually open today, so we may see people wander in and out. So don't mind them, or I hope they don't mind me. So where I left off was basically in my 20s, maybe early 30s, with therapy. I think I gained some ground with it, but things such as transitioning and dealing with gender dysphoria is something that went to the side because it was all about coping strategies for now, back then, clearly. And I've said in other videos that I think that the general hostility around being trans, now a lot of people might think that there's a lot of hostility right now, and to be sure there is some in Australia and there's a hell of a lot in the US, so I don't want to minimize that. But back in the 90s, transitioning meant things like losing your job if you're transitioning on the job or someone found out, instantly, with no recourse to anti-discrimination laws. So that's a whole other side issue, but yeah, the various circles of hell. So I did try to socially transition as a young person, but I got a lot of aggression both in Melbourne and Perth, to the point where if it had escalated even more, I might have lost my life. So that scared the bejesus out of me, because I grew up with different forms of aggression meted out on me, and I just wanted to reconstruct some kind of normal life, right? And because I'm not an absolute idiot, I went back to university in my late 20s and I began to study part-time while I was working as well, with different activist groups, not specifically on matters to do with the trans community, but I was going along to meetings on things trans, public fora and stuff like that. But mainly it was between Friends of the Earth and ASIET, which was the Australian Solidarity group for East Timor. So in my first years of university, I began to connect with ASIET, but also was a member of a group called Third World Action Group, TWAG. I was the first person to move to change that name, but I don't think it happened. But I drifted in and out of those worlds, between activist worlds and university part-time, after years of being in, sort of in the milieu of forest blockaders, colloquially known as ferals, and also anarchists, punk anarchists, and squatting. But when I got my first official relationship is when I moved into a flat and had this kind of private life, or whatever you want to call it, of mutual dependence in a couple. That was a sweet space. It wasn't without its issues, particularly since I was studying all the time. And I guess it was kind of in that context that I just began to sort of settle into a kind of lull or predictability and focus on the present and even the future. So therapy did help with that. My then partner was aware of my gender stuff and had no issues, right? But I think that I just was going through a process of bodily healing after all this memories of CSA and inadequate responses to that, especially at an institutional level, because I did have emergency housing at one point. This is different from my engagements with Casa House. was actually with Hanover Welfare Services. So one of my cousins had a friend who worked within welfare services, and they helped me get beyond the sort of emergency housing into something a bit more like what we'd call these days social housing. It was only ever going to be temporary, and this was prior to squatting, by the way. But basically, I had what was known as a housing officer. I had a social worker. We never touched on anything around the CSA because their whole approach was, that's god awful, but you have to work from the present. So I kind of took that on. I embraced me being queer, and I almost ended up living when my housemate moved out because I lived with someone who was from the drag scene and was trans. But by then I was like, I want to get out of this system. I want more autonomy. I'm sick of having to see a social worker. Became a bit more radicalized. Sorry, the temporalities are a little bit loopy. Then I did the squat thing, and then I ended up in a relationship with someone. It's not Anglo-Saxon, because I find it really hard. I'm not averse to someone on the basis of being Anglo-Saxon, but having life experience, including being of working class experience and diasporic migrant experience, was kind of something I identified with more. And yeah, just someone who was creative and beautiful, and still is. Where do we go from there? Oh, okay, so my trajectory through university, 5 years actually, took 5 years. But in that period, and this was post that initial relationship because that broke up, when I went as an exchange student to Mexico, I was determined to come back and write about representation of sex work, because in all those years I'd also been involved in that kind of form of labour. I won't go into detail about that. But yeah, I guess I just lived in different kinds of peripheries, circled around my issues, and it's not until much later that I went back into therapy again, and actually several relationships on, because I had 3 main relationships, like monogamous relationships. In between times, I also had intimacies with someone that is a bit larger than life, and if she ever watches this, she might be able to identify herself. But that was also a space of permission and experimentation about, identity. So yeah, drug use, blah blah blah. Let's not go into the stuff that makes it seem like I've got this victim narrative. But where I end up in therapy is with someone who was using CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for my depression and for anticipatory grief because of my mom getting really sick and me being really folded into her care and getting really stressed out from it. That was the first sign, and I needed to go back into therapy. But then kind of a year or 2 in, this therapist was very frank with me and said, you have trauma, and this is not within my toolkit. Have you ever thought of doing EMDR? So that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. Yes, eye movement. It's very different from the aforementioned therapy, which is why she suggested it. And pretty much when I touched base with someone who is a clinical psychologist and a specialist in EMDR, she recognized that I had CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, brought on by all of the stuff around mum's care and the reactivation of early childhood experiences, which again I don't have to go into big detail on that. And it's really through that process of healing through EMDR that I began to be able to re-examine my dysphoria and untangle it from the other things, because that was always a challenge and something that I would self-question about. But my therapist has always said, stay curious, right? And this is part of my reintegration. It's pretty miraculous in a way, because I can get halfway through a life and still be here. after all the things that happened. A lot of people in the milieu that I moved in, they're not with us anymore, whether by overdose or suicide. Sorry, unaliving. Delete that. Or other ways in which they lost their way. I'll probably have to go back in and edit that word out. But anyway, none of this is to trigger any of you, but just to say that yes, another therapy is possible and you can heal, but it is a constant process. Is it expensive? Yeah, it can be. We do have mental health care plans these days in Australia. You can consult with your GP and get an assessment. Usually they use a kind of survey instrument to assess the level of depression and anxiety, for example, and the impact on your life. And then you can get a referral. My path has not been linear, as you should know from the last video, but here I am, and I'm also grateful for all the people who have helped me along the way, who shed light on things, have helped me understand myself as well, and move to survivorhood as a trans person. Yeah. So that's it in a nutshell from me.